Well, this morning we'll be continuing on in the Sermon on the Mount. And as last week we looked at, Jesus mentions that he did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but he came to fulfill. And the remainder of chapter 5, he kind of elaborates on what, well, you could say the written law, but it wasn't just the written law. He was clarifying the written law, but really going against the oral law of how the religious leaders had interpreted the written law from the Old Testament. Now this morning, I would like to, have you ever heard somebody tell you, I'm not that bad of a person, at least I haven't killed anybody? Anybody ever hear that phrase? And my question with that is, where did we come up with the standard that as long as you didn't kill somebody, you're a pretty good person? I mean, I'll give you just a few statistics. Now, on the first step, I would have to say, I'm really glad that you haven't killed somebody. I'll just start with that. But just a few statistics. The number of homicides in England and Wales varies from year to year, of course. In 2023, there were 583 homicides, which is slightly more than the previous year. So when you have 61 million people, it mentions in the year ending in 2023, the homicide rate was 9.9 victims per million people. Okay? So when you think about that, now, that's not good, but in a sense, when we go back to that question, I'm a pretty good person because I haven't killed anybody. In one sense, if you want to go down to the ratios, that is putting yourself in the top 99.999% of the people. Think about that. I'm not bad because I am at least in the top 99.999% of the people. How many of you would say, if your child came home and your parent asked you, what did you get on the test? Wasn't too bad. I'm at least in the top 99.999% of the class. That means there's only 0.0001% that you classify as worse than you. So why do we use that as a standard? And I think in one sense it's because it is the one command that nearly every person would agree that there should be some type of law when it comes to actually taking somebody else's life, right? If you went around the UK, if you were to go down through and people would justify this and justify that, and okay, yeah, I've lied, and I've taken things that don't belong to me, and when it comes to adultery, people just, that's not that big of a deal anymore. But when it comes to murder, yes, absolutely, there ought to be a law about that. When Jesus gets into this, the real question is, where do we draw the line? Is it just when you go over the line and you actually take somebody's life? Or is there a reason and a purpose behind the original command? And as Jesus goes into this, and we'll read through Matthew chapter 5 and verse 21, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder. And whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment.'" And they would have been, yes, absolutely. We agree with that. And all today we would say, yes, that's a good thing. But all of a sudden Jesus goes on, he says, "But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, 'Raka,' which in a sense is empty, or worthless, bonehead," right? We may hear of a word like that, "shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge, and the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I say to you, you will by no means get out of there till you have paid the last penny. Now, in one sense, what Jesus is doing, he's going back to the spirit of the law rather than just the letter of the law. Now, what Jesus is not teaching, you might read through this and think, you know what? So does that mean that being angry with somebody and calling them names is just as bad as murdering them? So does that mean, like, if I'm angry with them and I'm starting to call them names, I may as well just go all the way and just get them out of my life? Is that what Jesus is saying? Well, no, that's not where Jesus is going. You might say, well, should the government raise the bar and make the same punishment if you get angry with somebody and start calling people names, that the government should step in and start prosecuting people and putting them in jail? Well, in one sense, you see that happening around the world in certain places. And in one sense, you might hear the word thought police. And, well, if you start calling people names online, well, you might start getting arrested. And, well, that's not necessarily where Jesus is going either. But yet, when we think about this, Jesus uses the same phrase when he talks about those that murder. He says, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. What is Jesus talking about? Well, in one sense, he's not just talking about the government judgment. He's saying there's a greater judgment as well. And every one of us, it's not just the law around us, but every one of us will stand before God and give an account of ourselves. But I want to go a little bit deeper. The real thing as we come to this is, what was the core of the command, you shall not murder? Well, I would say the core, the very core of that command is that every human being has dignity, value, and worth because each one of us is created in the image of God. When we recognize, going right back to creation, that every human being has dignity, value, and worth because we are created in the image of God, that helps us to recognize why God would say, don't take a person's life. But if all you do is put the emphasis on don't murder, does that mean that we can treat people however we want to? We can treat people as dirt as long as we don't kill them so they become dirt. Is that all right? For us just to treat people however we want to? And what Jesus is saying here is going back to the very core of that command, recognizing that every human being has dignity, value, and worth. And we don't just treat people however we want as long as we don't cross the line. He says there are certain things way before crossing that line that we need to guard our hearts against. And as Jesus mentions here throughout chapter 5, so much was placed on the actions, the external, the actual killing of a person, or the actual committing adultery. But what Jesus does is he goes right back to the heart, because he's going back to the very core of the commandments. Now, this isn't saying, well, you know what, if Jesus or if God wanted like the core of the command, why didn't he just say it? Well, if you were to go back to the written law, there was much that spoke back to the core of the command. In fact, Leviticus 19, verse 16 and 17, it says, you shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin against him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So it wasn't that Jesus just skipped over and never talked about the core of these commands. But what the religious leaders had done is they had distanced and separated. Okay, we're going to teach these ones, but, well, we're going to skirt over some of these other ones because those get too personal for us. And if we were to emphasize these ones, then people could actually recognize that we're not actually following these ones. So we'll emphasize the big ones. We haven't done that. We'll interpret it our own way and put our own emphasis on it. Now I want to go in deeper a little bit because Jesus specifically mentions about anger. How many of you have ever gotten angry? And it mentions there, got angry without a cause. Now, I know there's many translations that don't have that without a cause, and maybe you actually prefer that little clause in there because how many of you, when you get angry, you have a cause? Right? I mean, we all have a reason. I have a right, I am justified, and we will justify ourselves for our anger. But I think we do have to do a soul searching here. What is it really that's driving the anger? What is it that really is fueling that anger? And then, with that anger, how do I display those emotions? What does it cause me to do? Now, a few questions we'll just ask straight up front. One we'll kind of look at is what is anger? Another is anger always a sin? Is anger always wrong? Another, we kind of have to do that soul searching of why do I get angry? Now, anger, definition, a strong feeling of annoyance, displeasure, or hostility. But as we think about, is anger always a sin? Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, as Paul is speaking to the church there in Ephesus, and he's describing of things that we should not do, and then he goes on to how we should treat one another. He mentions in Ephesians 4 and verse 26, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. So Paul is saying there is a time, there can be a place where we can be angry. But he gives warnings along the way. Don't sin. You can be angry, but don't let it cause you to sin. Then he goes on and he says, do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. What is he doing? Do not allow that anger to reside in your heart. Do not allow that anger to continue to grow and fester in your heart. Deal with it. Take care of it. Because otherwise it will lead to resentment and it will lead to bitterness. And when we become resentful and bitter, we are opening up the door for Satan to come in. And Satan desires to hurt us, to harm us, and to break relationships. Now, some people will take this verse and say, for a husband and wife, you better settle every argument before you go to bed because it says, do not let the sun go down upon your wrath. Now, I do not believe that is necessarily the case because there are times where it may be healthy for you to sleep on it. How many times have you had something, it seemed like a big pressing issue, you went to bed, you woke up, and it's like, you know what? Really wasn't that big of a deal. And so I'm not saying, and I don't believe Paul is saying, hey, husband and wife, you better settle every single argument before you go to bed. If you are tired, it's probably going to escalate and you'll never go to bed. And it's not going to be good. But if you go to sleep, you get well rested, you wake up in the morning, you may actually realize what we were arguing about wasn't that big of an issue. So don't take it in that way. But what he's saying is there's a time and a place where we can be angry, But be very cautious, it doesn't lead to sin. Now the question goes back to, when is there a time and a place? If you were to look at Jesus' life, we understand and recognize he is God and he did not sin. But there were also times that he did get angry. Why did he get angry? And what didn't cause him to become angry? And what you will find, well, he became indignant or angry towards his disciples when his disciples stopped parents from bringing children to Jesus. He became angry when the religious leaders were really profiting off of religion and selling livestock there in the temple, raising up the price, which was hindering people from coming in and worshiping God. He became angry when, well, there was a man in the synagogue whose hand was withered and it needed to be healed, and the religious leaders did not want him to heal the man because it was the Sabbath day. And they were exalting up the Sabbath more than they were exalting up a man and the dignity of man. And what you will find is the only thing that caused Jesus to become angry was when, well, the marginalized, the vulnerable, when those that could not defend themselves were being attacked and hurt or used by those that were in authority. And that caused an anger within him. But what did not cause anger is when he was personally persecuted. When he was personally being beaten. When he was personally being mistreated, mocked, scorned. Now, if we were to look at a mirror, what causes us to get angry the most? And I would dare say, most often, for us, it's about the personal things, not about the issues out there. Now, we have to ask ourselves, why do I get angry? Now, I recognize we don't get angry very often. We use a different word. I just get frustrated. How many get frustrated, but we rarely get angry? But you know what? Frustration is just another word and another form of anger. But what causes it? And I would say you could say it in two different ways, two different phrases, but both it kind of comes together. Most often, it is not about the right way or the wrong way. It's about my way. And if we were honest with ourselves when we get angry, we could say, I am angry because I'm not getting my way. Right? Now, there's another way of saying it. I am getting angry because I am not in control. And in fact, the definition of frustrated, the feeling of being upset or annoyed as a result of being unable to change or achieve something. Which means I don't have the power or control to change it. Most often, we get angry, it's because we feel like we don't have control. And that may be because somebody else or something is getting in our way. A pastor and an author, Rich Villodas, he says to be angry is to feel in control. It's a convenient way to distance ourselves from weakness and vulnerability. It's a way to give the illusion of strength when anger bubbles up from within. It's usually because of unmet expectations, anxiety, or the need to be in charge. Would we agree with that? And I would say probably. And in fact, we'll be looking at anxiety in a few weeks from now. And in one sense, anger and anxiety, the root of both, really is in control. Anger is about not having control over the past or the present circumstances. Anxiety is about not having control over the future circumstances. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, and I don't have control over what's going to happen in the future, and we become anxious. We become angry because, well, I don't have control over what has just happened and what is happening right now, so that anger sets in. And really, in one sense, and it's especially displayed when it speaks about anxiety later on in the chapter, but really it is about surrendering that control to God. Now, when we come back to this passage and we think about whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment, and whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. He's speaking really when we get angry at somebody else, we don't have that control. Somebody else is in our way. Now, can I be a little more open and personal? I can find myself getting angry, if you will. I'll just be honest. With my older children more than I do with my daughter. And that is not just because her sweet charm and her sweet smile, and she's just so delightful. But if I tell Amara, you need to go upstairs, and she doesn't do it, what do? Well, you know what? I can just walk right up to her. I can pick her up. I can carry her up the stairs, and I can just make her do whatever I want her to do, right? What about my boys? And I tell them to do something, and they don't do it. Do you know what I do? I go up to them, I pick them up, and I carry them upstairs, and I just make them. No. Now, I could, but it wouldn't be quite right? So instead, if they don't do what I want them to do, and I don't feel like I can force them to do it, that's when it begins to bubble up from within. And then we use the anger to cause a fear in the other person, which puts us back in that position of being in control, and we can manipulate the situation to get what we want, right? How many agree with me? I'm not the only person. Which is going right back, as Rich puts it, to be angry is to feel in control. It's a convenient way to distance ourselves. We don't want to admit our weakness. We don't want to admit that we're not in control. So we're going to use this anger to put ourselves back in control and take control of the situation. Well, in this situation, as Jesus is saying, he's saying, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment, but whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council, but whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of the hellfire. All of a sudden, this is taking it to that level of name-calling. Now, as adults, we say, we don't do name-calling. That's for children. We hear children, and they call names, and whether it's siblings, whether it's in the schoolyard, and name-calling is for children. We've grown up. We've gone past that. No, I don't think we have. We, as adults, and I would say especially as British, right? We don't say it to their face. We just say it behind their back. Or on social media. Just not to their face. To their face would be too confrontational. And that would put me in danger. So I'll just go ahead, we'll slander, we'll call names, we'll do things behind people's back, just not towards their face. No. How many of you, if you're a parent, well, you don't have to raise your hand, you've had a child say, I hate you. Well, it's really not they hate you, it's just they hate that you stand in the way of getting what they want. And what this is doing is Jesus is saying, you're not seeing people with their dignity, value, and worth. Instead, you are pointing completely at yourself. All you care about is yourself, and you will do anything to dominate yourself over them, push them out of the way, calling them names, pushing them down to make yourself appear better. And he says, how do you think God sees that? He loves that human being. Jesus died for that human being. They have the same dignity, value, and worth as you do, because they were created in the image of God. Now, yes, I understand. Some people, when you look around and you think about the evil things that people do, it's hard to see the dignity, value, and worth. It's hard to see the image of God in them. But that's where we have to recognize and difference their actions from the human being. And when you were born, before you ever had a behavior, before you ever had a belief, God loves you. And you had dignity, value, and worth because you were created and formed in the image of God. And so it's a reminder, how do we actually see people? What if every human being, every individual that you spoke to and spoke about, you recognized them and viewed them created in the image of God, loved by God? Jesus died for that person. Would we treat them differently? And I would say we probably would. And so he's cautioning, he's going right back to the very core of the command. And then he goes on. He mentions there in verse 34, he says, therefore, or verse 23, therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Jesus places that emphasis on reconciliation. He's not just stopping at the part of don't be angry at people, don't start calling people names. He says, no, try to find a way to make things right. Now, to put this in our modern vocabulary, it might be, you know what, if you come into church and you're serving and you know that there's an issue, wait a minute. Try to go and seek to restore. Try to find a way. Now, is every relationship going to be restored? It's not. We've kind of looked at some of that. And even when Jesus mentions back in the Beatitudes, he mentions, blessed are the peacemakers. And the very next one is, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Yes, try to seek peace. God desires relationships to be restored. Is it going to happen every time? No. But at least try. And he goes on, so as we think about that passage, in fact, in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 14, he says, we know that we have passed from death to life because we love the brethren. He who does not love his brother abides in death. Whoever hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us. And we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. He says, how do we know love? And he mentions about hate. And he even ties in, just as Jesus was saying, is hatred really amounts to a murder. It's trying to put somebody out of the way so that I can get my way. And John, he mentions one of the ways that we know that we can have eternal life. One of the ways that we know we are a follower of Jesus and a child of God is how the affection that we have towards others, brothers and sisters in Christ. Now remember the commandments that Jesus gave. the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And the second is like unto it. In one sense, the second is linked to it. You cannot do the first without doing the second. Love your neighbor as yourself. Why is that? Because your neighbor is created in the image of God. How do we interact with people? How do we speak about people? How do we seek to restore a relationship? He goes on in verse 25. He says, agree with your adversary. So the first section was kind of more about your brothers. Now he says, agree with your adversary or your opponent quickly while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge and the judge hand you over to the officer and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I say to you, you will by no means get out of there till you have paid the last penny. He says, whether it's your brother of trying to reconcile and restore that relationship, or whether it's an opponent, an adversary, try to find a way to agree. You know, in most situations, many situations, we can agree on a lot of things. And sometimes it's only a very small percentage that we disagree. But which part do we focus on? That little part that we disagree. And in one sense, whether this is, you know what, you owe somebody, or whatever the situation, because it mentions there, owe the last penny. So in one sense, whether this is you're going to jail because you owed somebody and you couldn't work it out, you couldn't figure out a way forward. He's saying try no matter what. Well, in another passage, live peaceably as much as lies within you. Live peaceably with all men. Now, we live in a day where it's becoming much more divided. And I would say we have a lot less face-to-face contact than there used to be. There's a lot more texting, there's a lot more social media, there's a lot more not personal communication. And I think what that has done, it allows us to speak our mind more openly and more publicly rather than speaking directly and personally to the individuals. And culture is shifting and culture is changing. But as followers of Jesus, going back to what Jesus has taught us, every human being is created in the image of God. And it's not just a line here that as long as you don't cross the line and actually take their life. No. How do we treat them all the way before that line? How are we seeking to restore those relationships? Which means going privately, directly to the person that is involved, and not publicly to those around us. With an adversary, trying to make a way and find a way to work through an issue, rather than just making it harder and more difficult. Now, if you were to go to the very end of the chapter, and Lord willing, we may look at it more later on, but he speaks more about how we treat one another. Why is that? Remember a few weeks ago, let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father, which is in heaven. Our light, how we live out this, even though it may be difficult to live it out, is a light to those around us. And in one sense, you could say, whether we do it or not, the light still shines. Just the difference is, As we do them, the light is shining outwards. As we don't do them, it's putting the light under the candle or the bushel and covering it up so that people don't see what's happening and they can't give God the glory for what he's done in our hearts. As we live out what Jesus has taught and how he lived, we can point people to him and give glory to God.